We're doing a 3-week series on problems, which is part of, I guess, just I'm an upbeat guy, right? Like, so we're going to spend 3 weeks in church talking about problems. But the reason I picked this series and the reason I decided to teach on this is because my thought was that life is full of problems. Sometimes we have a hard time identifying them. We can identify the tragedies and the big challenges that face us, but very often there are problems that we face in life and we're kind of unaware we're going through them. And it might be good to just sort of elevate some of these things and see them really as the spiritual opportunities that I think they are. And I really do mean it. I think they're spiritual opportunities. As you look at it, there's a temptation to think that you're not being spiritual enough if you're facing problems, and that if you just were more spiritual, you wouldn't have problems. But the sub-theme of our 3-week series has been, these are Paul's problems. These are problems that the Apostle Paul encountered as he continued to follow Christ. And in many ways, the problems sort of erupted because he was following Christ. But the last reason I want to do it is that I think the Christian faith offers different solutions. While problems may be a universal experience that all of us go through, I think as Christians we have unique and different solutions. And for Paul and for all of us, the fact that we are followers of a Savior who died and rose again changes the way we deal with problems. So we've been looking at problems. It's not an exhaustive list by any measure, but I picked these because I feel like they're not only kind of risen up in the life of Paul, but they're really typical problems that we deal with. The first week we looked at the problem of recognition and respect and how we struggle with gaining that and how do we get that. Last week we looked at the problem of too many words. And this week I want to look at the problem of endings. You know, it's an amazing thing in life and it's part of the flow of life, but it hit me as we were participating in Gallagher's dedication, how just yesterday morning I was in this sanctuary doing a funeral for Mark Mitchell, who was starting to come to the church and died tragically a week ago, and how so much of the rhythm of life is this rhythm of endings and new beginnings, and endings and new beginnings. And it's very easy, I think, to observe the new beginnings and to get their attention, but oftentimes the endings we are not always aware of. We don't often want to acknowledge or see or embrace endings. I'm not necessarily talking about big, huge, sad endings like the Mitchell family's going through, but I think there's a certain rhythm to life of endings and new beginnings all the time. They can be subtle, small things like a friend moving away, or maybe you're switching schools. Maybe you're getting ready to graduate from high school or college and you realize that part of your life is going to end and there's a new beginning coming. Maybe your career has changed, whether you wanted it to or not. And maybe there are things that you just can't do anymore that you used to be able to do physically. Maybe you're an empty nester or newly retired. Maybe you're upsizing your house or downsizing it and you're moving and all of that stuff. Maybe your child started school your youngest child started school for the first time this fall. We all go through endings and new beginnings in our life. Life is full of endings, and often we don't take the time to acknowledge them and how these endings can create for us problems. Pastor and author Pete Scazzero points out that our culture tends to see endings as some sort of sign of failure or real problem, so we suppress it. We usually don't deal with endings well. We tend to deny or blame or rationalize. And very often what we don't even acknowledge, because we're doing that, we don't even acknowledge that, wow, like maybe some of these endings are creating problems for me. He asked some really good questions, I thought, that were interesting, that might be a sign that maybe there's an ending in your life that you're still trying to process or deal with. Do you continue to ruminate about something in the past? Are you using busyness as an excuse not to grieve? Can you identify feelings of sadness, anger, or fear, and do you ignore these feelings? Are you frustrated by your own limits and struggle with envy? Are you medicating your feelings with the wrong things? Alcohol, social media, porn, inappropriate relationships? Can you handle the feeling that something you started has failed? These questions might be indicators that there are endings that maybe are creating problems for you. Paul faced the problems of endings. In his last chapter, in his last letter, he's imprisoned. He may or may not know that the end of his life is coming, but at a minimum he knows he's in jail and things are not looking good. And he begins to reflect. And he sees an ending coming, and he's in a sense preparing to pass the baton onto a new generation, including Timothy, who he writes the letter, 2 Timothy. And this causes him to reflect on an ending. And so I want to look at that this morning, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 through 8. This is Paul writing to Timothy. And he says, "As for me, I'm already being poured out as a libation, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. From now on, there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing." Paul faces this ending, and in some ways I think he models for us my point. One of the sub-themes of this series on problems is problems are things you grow through. They don't go away. God doesn't always remove, because I think he wants us to learn to grow through them. And I have found endings a very painful and challenging thing in my life, and I feel like learning how to grow through them is important. And Paul, I think, models for us a way that you grow through endings. And the very first thing that you see here is that Paul paid attention to how he felt. Let's look at verse 6 again, if we can call that back up. He says, "As for me, I am already being poured out as a libation, and the time of my departure has come." I don't know how many of you know what the word libation means, right? Very few. A couple of you do, right? Libation means a drink offering. If in Paul's Jewish context, there would be all sorts of sacrificial offerings. They would sacrifice a cow, they'd sacrifice a goat, they'd sacrifice a dove, they would have all these sacrifices. The libation was the drink offering, and the drink offering was a real small, just kind of poured out on top of the other offerings. It was kind of a nondescript, less showy offering than the big cow or whatever. And Paul sort of says, this is how I feel. I feel like a piddly little drink offering. And my life is just kind of being poured out. He doesn't judge it. He doesn't get into why that is the case or whatever. He pays attention enough to how he feels to identify. He's like, man, I feel like a drink offering being poured out. I often wonder what Paul meant. Was this a good feeling? Like I've been used, I feel like I'm empty, I emptied the cup, I left it all on the field kind of thing? Is that what Paul's saying? Or is it a bad feeling? Like I just feel like, I'm poured out. I'm being poured out. I'm empty. I have nothing left. I'm not really sure. I don't know exactly how Paul felt, but what I think is interesting is that Paul was at least paying attention to what he felt. Paying attention enough that he was able to describe how he felt. And he used imagery and thought about it and said, comparing, this is what I feel like. I feel like blank. That actually takes some work, right? To put words to feelings and to identify that this ending is sort of creating this emotion or this feeling inside of me. This week, we put our dog down, which is like one of life's really bad moments, I don't like feeling sad. And Ann and Matt were just crying and crying and crying. And I had to keep, personally fighting this desire to just not check out. And I probably didn't do a great job. If you ask Ann or Matt, I probably didn't do a great job. But at least I kind of caught myself, okay, don't totally check out of this moment because it's so overwhelmingly sad and you just don't want to deal with it. Because I knew an ending was coming and it was creating a lot of emotion, and I was like, I don't know what endings are going on in your life, but odds are there's some kind of ending happening. And I think Paul rightly initially just paid attention to how he felt. And he was able to describe it and to name it and to think about it. And I guess I would just encourage you to try to do that yourself. To try to pay attention to what's going on inside of you as you face it. A lot of us, when we face endings, honestly, probably one of the biggest emotions that endings create for most of us is fear. Right? Because you realize something that I counted on, something that was a regular part of my life is no longer going to be there. Maybe you're a college student, you're coming to the end of your college career. You got to, now you got to make a living. What's that supposed to look like? Right? And, it creates a lot of fear and anxiety, and it's easy to ignore it. It takes a lot more courage to be I feel afraid. I don't know what it is for you, but I know this, pay attention. The very first thing that endings, I think, create an opportunity for us is to pay attention to how we feel. Paul did that. He said, as for me, I'm being poured out like a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. But then in verse 7, Paul does the next thing, which I think is really good. And again, this is something Pete Scazzero talked about. Paul models for us learning how to live in the confusing in-between. Live in the confusing in-between. I was just talking to someone about my dog. Someone here, I think it might have been you, Billy. You were like, the best thing you do is get another dog right away, right? Which is my wife is shaking her head, amen to that. So, but the truth of the matter is that sometimes, and sometimes endings just don't work that way. What makes the endings that are hard are the endings that don't end to something right away. Kind of like when you're on the trapeze. Sometimes I felt like this in life. I'm the trapeze guy, and I let go of the bar behind me, and I'm hanging there in midair. I'm like, I'd like to see that new bar coming in right about now, right? And one of the things that's really challenging in seasons of endings, and the problem of endings is often the new beginnings aren't emerging right away, and that's difficult. And Paul learned to live, I think, in the confusing in-between. People often say, and I completely agree with them, that when God closes a door, he opens a window. I do believe that. I watch God do that all the time. But very often there is a time gap between the door closing and the window opening, right? And Paul invokes endurance imagery here. This is great poetic. This is a great verse. This is just a great verse. And this is one of those that if you just kind of look at your life and you get to the end of your life and you live through a lot of in-betweens, and you can look around and you can be like, hey, you know what I did? I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I kept the faith. But these are all endurance imageries, fought, finished, kept. Paul, I'm sure, felt like many people felt as things were ending and changing. He's like, I want to live in this confusing in-between by enduring and fighting through it. Think of some of the endings that Paul endured. In one way, he faced the ending of his whole way of life. He switched from being, from Judaism to Christianity. Paul was an itinerant. He would go from city to city, get to know people, start churches, then leave. It had to be hard. The book of Acts talks about Paul weeping with the elders of Ephesus as he said goodbye. A lot of the work Paul talked about, just like we talked about 2 weeks ago, didn't totally take. He would start something and then all these people would come in and it would fall apart, and Paul had to face problems and disappointments and divisions, He faced a lot of endings. And he was not exempt from ending in his life, but you know what he did? He trusted in God, he believed in Jesus, and he lived in the confusing in-between. Are you in the confusing in-between? I know I am in some places. I know I am when I keep daydreaming about ways to get out of it. That's one of my big signs. I'm in the in-between. I want an answer. I want God to make it clear, but he doesn't seem to be on the same timetable that I am. But God, has to create new opportunities and bring new life out of where there now feels like only death. And learning to wait is such a significant thing. The philosopher Max Picard said this. He said, if you stop while everyone else is moving, you'll have the appearance of gaining distance. Whoa, that's a weird sound. In other words, it's everyone's drifting away and you just stop, it will look like you're moving forward. And the Apostle Paul said, look, it would be easy for me to drift downstream, but I haven't done that. I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I kept the faith. Spiritual practices become so important here. Just doing regular things to help you stay in the game. How do you get still? How can you live in the confusing in between? I came across a list as I was reflecting on this that I think would be good. These are good ways for you to think about if you're facing an ending or something's ending, how do you live in the confusing in between? Number one is practice silence. Learn to be still and to listen to God. I've a lot of times now learned to, when I get somewhere, if I get somewhere early, just to turn my car off and just to sit in my car. Just sit and just be still and be quiet. No music, no phone, no nothing. But just be still a little bit in the presence of God and just learn how to listen to him. Connect with God. How do you slow down enough that you can be with God? I've learned to love to walk. Just take walks and listen to worship music and all that stuff. I just want it. Do you have things that are helping you feel like you connect with God? So while everything else is something's ending and there's a lot of confusion in your life, what do you do to foster your sense of personal connection with God? How about seeking wise counsel? How about finding a trusted spiritual friend, maybe outside of the circumstance that you're in, that maybe can help you discern the fact that, hey, you're in an ending. Things are ending, and maybe you don't see it, but other people can see it. Saint Benedict, when he put together Benedict's rule, which was a monastic rule, said this: it's important for Christians to remember their deaths daily. The psalmist says, teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Endings remind us of our limits. Someday all of this will end for us. Are we learning to be humble enough, dependent enough to trust God to recognize this, that everything you have is actually a gift? It's all a gift. It was yours to steward and manage, but not to hold. The Christian faith is not ultimately about death. It's about resurrections. It's about the truth that God can take out of death and bring new life to it, but you've got to allow God to do that. Dallas Willard, the philosopher, said this: with God, we live in a world where nothing good ever gets lost. And so what I think Paul is saying here, he's not saying I gutted it out, I just sucked it up. No, he's actually saying I am so glad I endured. I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I kept the faith. I'm glad I endured, because in verse 8 he says this. His new beginning looks like this in verse 8. I think we should have a slide. If you're back there, there we go. From now on, there's reserved for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day. The hope that Paul held on to in the midst of his endings is new beginnings, and he longs for those. He longs for those. It's interesting. The next slide should say this, which I think is really fascinating. Not only for me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. Here's what I think is really fascinating, and what I'd love for you to take away from this. Paul longs for, he knows that God's going to bring a new beginning out of this ending, and God's going to give him a crown of righteousness, that God's going to reward his waiting upon him as he waits through the ending. But what I find interesting is that Paul doesn't say this. He doesn't say, I sucked it up, I finished the race, I did all the right things, and because I did everything right and I never made any mistakes, I know when this is over, I'm going to win and I'm going to get my little crown and you're all going to think I'm great. He doesn't say that. He says, I know I'm going to get a crown of righteousness, but you know the only reason he says he gets a crown of righteousness is that he longs for Jesus' appearing. See, very often what endings do for us is make us long for something. We kind of long for there's got to be more to this. Like, this can't be the end. There has to be something beyond this that God is doing, and endings have a unique way of making us face our own limitations and our own failures, our own smallness in order to find the greatness of God. And Paul says, look, this is what I've learned. This is what I've held on to. I have longed for Jesus to appear because I know there's got to be more. There's got to be more. And all the little endings I've gone through make me long for him. The best things endings do is make us long for something more. You don't get the crown because you deserve it. You get the crown because you're waiting for Jesus. I don't know what makes you long. I mean, I think that's maybe the question that endings are great to ask you about. Like, what are you longing for? What is it that you want? And maybe the best thing you can want is to long for Jesus to be more than he is for you right now. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Last Battle, which is the end of his Chronicles of Narnia. It's this big series of books which are great. He tells the story of the people in Narnia comes to the end, and they're leaving Narnia behind, and they're basically entering into heaven. And this is how he describes their entrance into heaven. And Aslan the lion is sort of the Jesus figure in the whole story, so that in case you don't know that. But he says this, and as he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion, but the things that began to happen after that were so great and beautiful that I cannot write them. And for us, this is the end of all the stories, and we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all the adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now, at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. The term is over, the holidays have begun, the dream is ended. This is the morning. Endings make us long for something more, to long for Jesus to come. And one day those longings will be met. And this will end, and the dream of this life will end, and the new life will begin. Endings create problems. But we have the hope of Jesus Christ to pull us through those problems. I'm going to invite the worship team to come on up. We thought it would be great to close this series with just "Great is thy faithfulness." As we encounter the problem of endings in our life, it's good to be reminded that God is faithful. He is pulling us through the keyhole into something far greater than we could ever imagine.